Chapter 3 of The Fortunate Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirsty. The Fortunate Youth by William John Locke. Chapter 3. The Fates arranged Barney Bill's entrance late on a Saturday afternoon in August. It was not dramatic. It was merely casual. They laid the scene in the brickfield. It had rained all day, and now there was a sullen clearance. Paul, who had been bathing with some factory boys in the not very savoury canal a mile or so distant, had wandered mechanically to his brickfield library, which, by means of some scavenging process, he managed to keep meagrely replenished. Here he had settled himself with a dilapidated book on his knees for an hour's intellectual enjoyment. It was not a cheerful evening. The ground was sodden and rank emanations rose from the refuse. From where he sat he could see an angry sunset, like a black-winged dragon, with belly of flame brooding over the town. The place wore an especial air of desolation. Paul felt depressed. Bathing in the pouring wet is a chilly sport, and his midday meal of cold potatoes had not been invigorating. These he had grabbed, and having done them up hastily in newspaper, had bolted with them out of the house. He had been fined heavily for slackness during the week, and Mr. Button's inevitable wrath at docked wages he desired to undergo as late as possible. Then, the sun had blazed furiously during the last 6 imprisoned days, and now the long-looked-for hours of freedom were disfigured by rain and blood. He resented the malice of things. He also resented the invasion of his brickfield by an alien van, a gaudy vehicle, yellow and red, to the exterior of which clinging wicker chairs, brooms, brushes and jute mats gave the impression of a lunatic's idea of decoration. An old horse, hobbled a few feet away, philosophically cropped the abominable grass. On the front of the van a man squatted with food and drink. Paul hated him as a trespasser and a gourmandizer. Presently the man, shading his eyes with his hand, scrutinised the small melancholy figure, and then, hopping from his perch, sped toward him with a nimble and curiously tortuous gait. He approached, a wiry, almost wizened little man of 50, tanned to gypsy brown. He had a shrewd, thin face, with an oddly flattened nose, and little round moist dark eyes that glittered like diamonds. He wore cloth cap on the back of his head, showing in front a thick mass of closely cropped hair. His collarless shirt was open at the neck, and his sleeves were rolled up above the elbow. "You're Polly Kegworth's kid, ain't you?" he asked. "Aye," said Paul. "Seen you afore, haven't I?" Then Paul remembered. 3 or 4 times during his life, at long, long intervals, the van had passed down Budge Street, stopping at houses here and there. About 2 years ago, coming home, he had met it at his own door. His mother and the little man were talking together. The man had taken him under the chin and twisted his face up. "Is that the nipper?" he had asked. His mother had nodded, and releasing Paul with a clumsy gesture of simulated affection, had sent him with 2pence for a pint of beer to the public house at the end of the street. He recalled how the man had winked his little bright eye at his mother before putting the jug to his lips. "I brought the beer for you," said Paul. "You did. It was the worst beer bar none I've ever had. I can taste it now." He made a wry face. Then he cocked his head on one side. "I suppose you're wondering who I am," he said. "Aye," said Paul. "Who art thou?" "I'm Barney Bill," replied the man. "Did you never hear of me? I'm known on the road from Taunton to Newcastle and from Hereford to Lowestoft. You can tell your mother that you seed me." A smile curled round Paul's lips at the comic idea of giving his mother unsolicited information. "Barney Bill," said he. "Yes," said the man. Then after a pause, "What are you doing of there?" "Reading," said Paul. "Let's have a look at it." Paul regarded him suspiciously, but there was a kindliness in the twinkling glance. He handed him the sorry apology for a book. Barney Bill turned it over. "Why," he said, "it ain't got no beginning and no end. It's all middle. Kenilworth. Do you like it?" "Aye," said Paul, "it's fine." "Who do you think wrote it?" As both cover and 100 pages at the beginning, including the title page, to say nothing of 100 pages at the end, were missing, Paul had no clue to the authorship. "Dunno," he said. "Sir Walter Scott." Paul jumped to his feet. Sir Walter Scott, he knew not why or how, was one of those bright names that starred in his historical darkness, like Caesar and Napoleon and Ridley and Latimer and W.G. Grace. Thou'rt sure, Sir Walter Scott? The shock of meeting Sir Walter in the flesh could not have been greater. The man nodded. Think I'd tell you a lie? I do a bit of reading myself in the old bus there. He jerked a thumb. I've got some books now. Would you like to see 'em? Would a mouse like cheese? Paul started off with his new companion. If it wasn't for a book or two, I'd go melancholy mad and bust myself, the latter remarked. Paul's spirit leaped toward a spiritual brother. It was precisely his own case. You'll find a lot of chaps that don't hold with books. Dessay you've met 'em. Paul laughed, precipient of irony. Barney Bill continued. I've heard some on 'em say, what's the good of books? Give me nature. And they goes and asks for it at the public house. Most say nothing at all, but just booze. Like father, said Paul. Eh? Cried his friend sharply. Sam Button, what married mother? Ali, so he boozes a lot, does he? Paul drew an impressionistic and lurid picture of Mr. Button. And they fight? Like Billy-O, said Paul. They reached the van. Barney Bill, surprisingly agile in spite of his twisted leg, sprang into the interior. Paul, standing between the shafts, looked in with curiosity. There was a rough, though not unclean bed running down one side. Beyond, at the stern so to speak, was a kind of galley containing cooking stove, kettle and pot. There were shelves, some filled with stock in trade, others with miscellaneous things, the nature of which he could not distinguish in the gloom. Barney Bill presently turned and dumped an armful of books on the footboard an inch or two below Paul's nose. Paul scanned the title pages. They were Goldsmith's Animated Nature, Inquire Within Upon Everything, an old-bound volume of Cassell's Family Reader, The Remains of Henry Kirke White, and Martin Chuzzlewit. The owner looked down on them proudly. I've got some more, but I can't get at 'em. Paul regarded him with envy. This was a man of great possessions. How long are you going to stay here? He asked, hopefully. Till sunrise tomorrow. Paul's face fell. He seemed to have no luck nowadays. Barney Bill let himself down to a sitting position on the footboard and reached to the end for a huge pork pie and a clasp knife which lay beside a tin can. I'll go on with my supper, he said. Then noticing a wistful, hungry look in the child's eyes, have a bit? He asked. He cut off a mighty hunk and put it into Paul's ready hand. Paul perched himself beside him, and they both ate for a long while in silence, dangling their legs. Now and again the host passed the tin of tea to wash down the food. The flaming dragon died into a smoky red above the town. A light or two already appeared in the fringe of mean houses. Twilight fell rapidly. Oughtn't you to be getting home? Paul, his hunger appeased, grinned. His idea was to sneak into the scullery just after the public houses closed, when his mother would be far too much occupied with Mr. Button to worry about him. Chastisement would then be postponed till the morning. Artlessly he laid the situation before his friend, who led him on to relate other amenities of his domestic life. Well, I'm jiggered, said Barney Bill. She must be a she-devil. Paul cordially agreed. He had already imagined the Prince of Darkness in the guise of Mr. Button. Mrs. Button was in every way fit to be the latter's diabolical mate. Encouraged by sympathy and shrewd questions, he sketched in broad details his short career, glorifying himself as the prize scholar and the erstwhile Grand Lama of Budge Street, and drawing a dismal picture of the factory. Barney Bill listened comprehendingly. Then, smoking a well-blackened clay, he began to utter maledictions on the suffocating life in towns and to extol his own manner of living. Having an appreciative audience, he grew eloquent over his lonely wanderings the length and breadth of the land, over the joy of country things, the sweetness of the fields, the wayside flowers, the vaulted highways in the leafy summer, the quiet, sleepy towns, the fragrant villages, the peace and cleanness of the open air. The night had fallen, and in the cleared sky the stars shone bright. Paul, his head against the lintel of the van door, looked up at them, enthralled by the talk of Barney Bill. The vagabond merchant had the slight drawling inflection of the home counties, which gave a soothing effect to a naturally soft voice. To Paul it was the pipes of Pan. "It mightn't suit everybody," said Barney Bill philosophically, "but some folks prefer gas to laylock. I don't say that they're wrong, but I like slaylock." "What's laylock?" asked Paul. His friend explained. No lilac bloomed in the blighted springs of Bludston. "Does it smell sweet?" "Yas. So does the may and the syringa and the new mown hay and the seaweed. Never smelled any of 'em?" "No," sighed Paul, sensuously conscious of new and vague horizons. "I once smelled summat sweet," he said dreamily. "It were a lady." "Do you mean a woman?" "No, a lady, like what you read of." "I've heard as they do smell good, like violets, some on 'em," the philosopher remarked. Drawn magnetically to this spiritual brother, Paul said almost without volition, "She said I were the son of a prince." "Son of a what?" cried Barney Bill, sitting up with a jerk that shook a volume or two onto the ground. Paul repeated the startling word. "Lor' lummy!" exclaimed the other. "Don't you know who your father was?" Paul told of his disastrous attempts to pierce the mystery of his birth. "A frying pan? Did she now? That's a mother for you." Paul disowned her. He disowned her with reprehensible emphasis. Barney Bill pulled reflectively at his pipe. Then he laid a bony hand on the boy's shoulder. "Who do you think your mother was?" he asked gravely. "A princess?" "Aye, why not?" said Paul. "Why not?" echoed Barney Bill. "Why not? You're a bloomin' lucky kid. I wish I was a missionaire. I know what I'd do." "What?" asked Paul, the ingenuous. "I'd find my high-born parents." "How?" asked Paul. "I'd go through the whole of England, asking all the princes I met. You don't meet 'em at every village pump, you know," he added quickly, lest the boy, detecting the bantering note, should freeze into reserve. "But if you keep your eyes skinned and your ears standing up, you can learn where they are. Lor' lummy, I wouldn't be a little nigger slave in a factory if I was the missionaire. Not much. I wouldn't be starved and beaten by Sam and Polly Button. Not me. Do you think your aforesaid high-born parents are going to dive down into this stinking suburb of hell to find you out? Not likely. You've got to find 'em, sonny. You can find anybody on the high road if you tramps long enough. What do you think?" "I'll find 'em," said Paul, in dizzy contemplation of possibilities. "When are you going to start?" asked Barney Bill. Paul felt his wages jingle in his pocket. He was a capitalist. The thrill of independence swept him from head to foot. "What time like the present?" "I'll start now," said he. It was night, quite dark save for the stars, the lights already disappearing in the fringe of mean houses whose outline was merged against the blackness of the town, the green and red and white discs along the railway line behind the dim mass of the gasworks, the occasional streak of conglomerate fireflies that was a tramcar, and the red, remorseless glow of here and there a furnace that never was extinct in the memory of man. And, save for the far shriek of trains, the less remote and more frequent clanging of passing tramcars along the road edged with the skeleton cottages, and startlingly near the vain munching and dull footfall of the old horse, all was still. Compared with home and Budge Street, it was the reposeful quiet of the tomb. Barney Bill smoked for a time in silence, while Paul sat with clenched fists and a beating heart. The simplicity of the high adventure dazed him. All he had to do was walk away, walk and walk, free as a sparrow. Presently Barney Bill slid from the footboard. "You stay here, sonny, till I come back." He limped away across the dim brickfield and sat down at the edge of the hollow where the woman had been murdered. He had to think, to decide a nice point of ethics. A vagrant seller of brooms and jute mats, even though he does carry about with him Cassell's Family Reader and the remains of Henry Kirke White, is distracted by few psychological problems. Sufficient for the day is the physical thereof. And when a man like Barney Bill is unencumbered by the continuous feminine, the ordinary solution of life is simple. But now the man had to switch his mind back to times before Paul was born, when the eternal feminine had played the very devil with him, when all sorts of passions and emotions had whirled his untrained being into dizziness. No passions or emotions now affected him, but their memory created an atmosphere of puzzledom. He had to adjust values. He had to deputise for destiny. He also had to harmonise the pathetically absurd with the grimly real. He took off his cap and scratched his cropped head. After a while he damned something indefinite and hastened in his dot and carry one fashion to the van. "Quite made up your mind to go in search of your high-born parents?" "Aye," said Paul. "Like me to give you a lift, say, as far as London?" Paul sprang to the ground and opened his mouth to speak, but his knees grew weak and he quivered all over like one who beholds the god. The abstract nebulous romance of his pilgrimage had been crystallised, in a flash, into the concrete. "Aye," he panted. "Aye," and he steadied himself with his back and elbows against the shafts. "That's all right," said Barney Bill in a matter-of-fact way, calm and godlike to Paul. "You can make up a bed on the floor of the old bus with some of them there mats inside, and we'll turn in and have a sleep and start at sunrise." He clambered into the van, followed by Paul, and lit an oil lamp. In a few moments Paul's bed was made. He threw himself down. The resilient surface of the mats was luxury after the sacking on the scullery stone. Barney Bill performed his summary toilet, blew out the lamp, and went to his couch. Presently Paul started up, smitten by a pang straight through his heart. He sprang to his feet. "Mister," he cried in the darkness, not knowing how else to address his protector, "I mun go whoam." "What?" exclaimed the other. "Thought better of it already? Well, go then, you little heathen hypocrite." "I'll come back," said Paul. "You're afeard, you little rat," said Barney Bill out of the blackness. "I'm not," retorted Paul indignantly. "I'm frightened of nowt." "Then what do you want to go for? If you've made up your mind to come along with me, just stay where you are. If you go home, they'll nab you and whack you for staying out late and lock you up, and you'll not be able to get out in time in the morning. And I ain't a-going to wait for you, I tell you straight." "I'll be back," said Paul. "Don't believe it. Good mind not to let you go." The touch of genius suddenly brushed the boy's forehead. He drew from his pockets the handful of silver and copper that was his week's wages, and groping in the darkness, poured it over Barney Bill. "Then keep that for me till I come back." He fumbled hurriedly for the latch of the van door, found it and leaped out into the waste under the stars, just as the owner of the van rose with a clatter of coins. To pick up money is a deeply rooted human instinct. Barney Bill lit his lamp and, uttering juicy though innocuous flowers of anathema, searched for the scattered treasure. When he had retrieved 3 shillings and 7 halfpenny, he peered out. Paul was far away. Barney Bill put the money on the shelf and looked at it in a puzzled way. Was it an earnest of the boy's return, or was it a bribe to let him go? The former hypothesis seemed untenable, for if he got nabbed, his penniless condition would be such an aggravation of his offence as to call down upon him a more ferocious punishment than he need have risked. And why in the name of sanity did he want to go home? To kiss his sainted mother in her sleep? To pack his blankety portmanteau? Barney Bill's fancy took a satirical turn. On the latter hypothesis, the boy was in deadly fear, and preferred the certainty of the ferocious punishment to the terrors of an unknown future. Barney Bill smoked a reflective pipe, looking at the matter from the 2 points of view. Not being able to decide, he put out his lamp, shut his door, and went to sleep. Dawn awoke him. It sat up and rubbed his eyes. Paul was not there. He did not expect him to be there. He felt sorry. The poor little kid had funked it. He had hoped for better stuff. He rose and stretched himself, put on socks and boots, lit his cooking stove, set a kettle to boil, and opening the door, remained for a while breathing the misty morning air. Then he let himself down and proceeded to the back of the van, where stood a pail of water and a tin basin, his simple washing apparatus. Having sluiced head and neck, and dried them with something resembling a towel, he hooked up the pail, stowed the basin in a rack, unslung a nose bag, which he attached to the head of the old horse, and went indoors to prepare his own elementary breakfast. That over, he put the horse into the shafts. Barney Bill was a man of his word. He was not going to wait for Paul, but he cast a glance round the limited horizon of the brickfield, hoping, against reason, to see the little slim figure emerge from some opening and run toward him. "Down the boy," said Barney Bill, taking off his cap and scratching his wet head. A low moan broke the dead silence of the Sunday dawn. He started and looked about him. He listened. There was another. The moans were those of a sleeper. He bent down and looked under the van. There J. Paul, huddled up, fast asleep on the bare ground. "Well, I'm jiggered, I'm just jiggered. Here, you, hello!" cried Barney Bill. Paul awakened suddenly, half sat up, grinned, grabbed at something on the ground beside him, and wriggled out between the wheels. "How long you been there?" "About 2 hours," said Paul. "Why didn't you wake me?" "I didn't like to disturb thee," said Paul. "Did you go home?" "Aye," said Paul. "Into the house?" Paul nodded and smiled. Now that it was all over, he could smile, but only afterwards, when he had greater command of language, could he describe the awful terror that shook his soul when he opened the front door, crept twice through the darkness of the sleeping kitchen, and noiselessly closed the door again. For many months he felt the terror of his dreams. Briefly he told Barney Bill of his exploit, how he had to lurk in the shadow of the street during the end of the battle between the Buttons, in which the lodgers and a policeman had intervened, how he had to wait, interminable hours, until the house was quiet, how he had stumbled over things in the drunken disorder of the kitchen floor, dreading to arouse the 4 elder little Buttons who slept in the room, how narrowly he had missed running into the arms of the policeman who had passed the door some seconds before he opened it, how he had crouched on the pavement until the policeman turned the corner, and how he had fled in the opposite direction. "And if your mother had caught ye, what would she have done to you?" "Half killed me," said Paul. Barney Bill twisted his head on one side and looked at him out of his twinkling eyes. Paul thought he resembled a grotesque bird. "What did you do it for?" he asked. "This," said Paul, holding out a grubby palm in which lay the precious cornelian heart. His friend blinked at it. "What the blazes is the good of that?" "It's a talisman," replied Paul, who, having come across the word in a book, had at once applied it to his treasure. "Lor' lummy," cried Barney Bill, "and it was for that bit of stuff you ran the risk of being flayed alive by your loving parents?" Paul was quick to detect a note of admiration underlying the superficial contemptuousness of the words. "I'd ha' gone through fire and water for it," he declared theatrically. "Lor' lummy," said Barney Bill again. "I got summat else," said Paul, taking from his pocket his little pack of Sunday school cards. Barney Bill examined them gravely. "I think you'd better do away with these." "Why?" "They establishes your identity," said Barney Bill. "What's that?" Barney Bill explained. Paul was running away from home. The police, informed of the fact, would raise a hue and cry. The cards, if found, would be evidence. Paul laughed. The constabulary was not popular in Budge Street. "Mother ain't going to have naught to do with the police, nor father either." He hinted that the cards might be useful later. His childish vanity loved the trivial encomiums inscribed thereon. They would impress beholders who had not the same reasons for preoccupation as Barney Bill. "You're thinking of your high-born parents," said Barney Bill. "All right, keep 'em. Only hide 'em away safe. And now get in and let us clear out of this place. It smells like a cheese with an escape of gas running through it. And you'd better stay inside and not show your face all day long. I don't want to be had up for kidnapping." Paul jumped in. Barney Bill clambered onto the footboard and took the reins. The old horse started and the van jolted its way to the road, on which as yet no tramcars clattered. As the van turned, Paul, craning his neck out of the window, obtained the last glimpse of Bludston. He had no regrets. As far as such a thought could be formulated in his young mind, he wished that the place could be blotted out from his memory, as it was now hidden forever from his vision. He stood at the little window, facing south, gazing toward the unknown region at the end of which lay London, city of dreams. He was not quite 14. His destiny was before him, and to the fulfilment thereof he saw no hindrance. No more would the remorseless factory cook catch him from his sleep and swing him into the relentless machine. Never again would he hear his mother's shrewish voice, or feel her heavy greasy hand about his ears. He was free. Free to read, free to sleep, free to talk, free to drink in the beauty of the lazy hours. Vaguely he was conscious that one of the wonders that would come would be his own expansion. He would learn many things which he did not know, things that would fit him for his higher state. He looked down upon the foreshortened figure of Barney Bill, his cloth cap, his shoulders, his bare brown arms, a patch of knee. To the boy, at that moment, it was less a man than an instrument of destiny guiding him, not knowing why, to the promised land. At last, on the quiet road, Paul saw a bicyclist approaching them. Mindful of Barney Bill's injunction, he withdrew his head. Presently he lay down on the couch, and soothed by the jogging of the van and the pleasant creaking of the baskets, fell into the deep sleep of tired and happy childhood. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of The Fortunate Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Danny Hogger. The Fortunate Youth by William John Locke. Chapter 4. It was a day of dust and blaze. Dust lay thick on the ground. It filled the air. It silvered the lower branches of the wayside trees. It turned the old brown horse into a dappled gray. It powdered the black hair of Barney Bill and of Paul until they looked like vagabond millers. They sat side by side on the footboard while the old horse jogged on, whisking flies away with the scanty but persistent tail. Paul, barefoot and bare-legged, hatless, coatless, absorbed blaze and dust with the animal content of a young lizard. A month's summer wandering had baked him to gypsy brown. A month's sufficient food and happiness had filled gaunt hollows in his face and covered all too visible ribs with flesh. Since his flight from Bludston, his life had been one sensuous trance. His hungry young soul had been gorged with beauty, the beauty of fields and trees and rolling country, of still, quivering moons and starlit nights, of exultant freedom, of never-failing human sympathy. He had a confused memory of everything. They had passed through many towns as similar to Bludston as one factory chimney to another, and had plied their trade in many a mean street, so much the counterpart of Budge Street that he had watched a certain window or door with involuntary trepidation, until he realized that it was not Budge Street, that he was a happy alien to its squalor, that he was a butterfly, a thing of woods and hedgerows fluttering for an inconsequent moment in the gloom. He came among them. None knew whence he was going, none knew whither. He was conscious of being a creature of mystery. He pitied the fettered youth of those begrimed and joyless towns, slaves, men with muckrakes he had fished up in old Pilgrim's Progress from the lower depths of the van, who obstinately refused to raise their eyes to the glorious sun in heaven. In his childish arrogance he would ask Barney Bill, "Why don't they go away and leave it, like me?" And the wizened little man would reply, with the flicker of an eyelid unperceived by Paul, "Because they haven't no eye-born parents waiting for 'em. They are born to their low estate, and they knows it," which to Paul was a solution of peculiar comfort. Even the blackened lands between the towns had their charm for Paul, in that he had a gleeful sense of being excluded from the wrath of God, which fell continuously upon them and the inhabitants thereof. And here and there a belt of leafy country gave promise, or confirmed Barney Bill's promise, of the paradise that would come. Besides, what belt of leafy country gave promise, or confirmed Barney Bill's promise, of the paradise that would come? Besides, what mattered the perpetuations of Bludston brickfields when the land of Beulah shimmered ahead in the blue distance? When Martin Chuzzlewit lay upon his knees, when the smell of the bit of steak sizzling on the cooking stove sung his young blood, and now they were in Warwickshire, county of verdant undulations and deep woods and embowered villages. Every promise that Barney Bill had made to him of beauty was in process of fulfillment. There were no more blighted towns, no more factories, no more chimneys belching forth smoke. This was the earth, the real broad-bosomed Mother Earth. What he had left was the hell upon earth. What he was going to might be paradise, but Paul's imagination rightly boggled at the conception of a paradise more perfect. And, as Paul's prescient wit had conjectured, he was learning many things, the names of trees and wild flowers, the cries of birds, the habits of wayside beasts, what was good for a horse to eat and what was bad, which was the wagon, and Orion's belt, and a bunch of keys in the heavens, how to fry bacon and sew up rents in his clothing, how to deal with his fellow man, or, rather, with his fellow woman, in a persuasive manner, how to snare a rabbit or a pheasant and convert it into food, and how, at the same time, to evade the terrors of the law, the differences between wheat and oats and barley, the main lines of cleavage between political parties, hitherto a puzzle to Paul, for Barney Bill was a politician, on the conservative side, and read his newspaper and argued craftily in taverns, and the styles and titles of great landowners by whose estates they passed, and how to avoid the nets that were perpetually spread by predatory sex before the feet of the incautious male. On the last point Barney Bill was eloquent, but Paul, with delicious memories sanctifying his young soul, turned a deaf ear to his misogyny. Barney Bill was very old and crooked and dried up. What beautiful lady would waste her blandishments on him? Even the low-born lasses with whom they at times consorted had scarce an eye for Barney Bill. The grapes were sour. Paul smiled indulgently on the little foible of his friend. They jogged along the high road in this blazing and dusty day. Their bower of wicked chairs crackled in the heat. It was too hot for sustained conversation. Once Barney Bill said, "If Bob was the old horse's unimaginative name, if Bob doesn't have a drink soon, his darned old hide'll crack." 10 minutes later, "Nothing under a quard'll wash down this dust." "Have a drink of water," suggested Paul, who had already adopted this care for drought, with satisfactory results. "A grown man's thirst and a boy's thirst is two entirely different things," said Barney Bill, sententiously. "To spoil this grown-up thirst of mine with water would be a crime." A mile or so farther on the road, he stretched out a lean brown arm and pointed. "See that there clump of trees? Behind that is the Little Bear Inn. They gives you cool china pots with blue round the edge. You can only have 'em if you asks for 'em, Jim Blake, the landlord, being particular like, and if yer breaks 'em—" "What would happen?" asked Paul, who was always very much impressed by Barney Bill's detailed knowledge of the roads and the inns of England. Barney Bill shook his head. "It would break his heart. Them pots was being used when William the Conqueror was a boy." 1066 to 1087, said Paul the scholar. "They mun be 900 years old." "Not quite," said Barney Bill, with an air of scrupulous desire for veracity. "But nearly. Lord lum," he exclaimed, after a pause. "It makes one think, doesn't it? One of them there quart mugs. Suppose it has been filled, say, 10 times a day, every day for 900 years. My gosh! What a Pacific Ocean of beer must have been poured from it. It makes one come from all of religious like when one puts it into one's head." Paul did not reply. The reverential emotion kept Barney Bill silent until they reached the clump of trees in the Little Bear Inn. It was set back from the road, in a kind of dusty courtyard masked off one side by a gigantic elm, and on the other by the fringe of an orchard with ruddy apples hanging patiently beneath the foliage. Close by the orchard stood the post bearing the signboard on which the little bear, an engaging beast, was pictured, and presiding in a ceremonious way over the horse trough below. In the shade of the elm stretched a trestle table and 2 wooden benches. The old inn, gabled, half-timbered, its upper story overhanging the doorway, bent and crippled through serene with age, mellow and yellow and russet, spectacled, as befitted its years, with leaded diamond panes, crowned deep in secular thatch, smiled with the calm and homely peace of everlasting things. Its old dignity even covered the perky gilt inscription over the doorway, telling how James Blank was licensed to sell a variety of alcoholic beverages. One human figure alone was visible as the chairs and mat-laden van slowly turned from the road toward the horse trough, that of a young man in straw, hat, and gray flannels making a watercolor sketch of the inn. Barney Bill slid off the footboard and, looking neither to right nor left, bolted like a belated crab into the cool recesses of the bar in search of ambrosia from the blue and white china mug. Paul, also afoot, led Bob to the trough. Bob drank from the lusty moderation of beasts. When he had assuaged his thirst, Paul backed him into the road, and slipping over his head a comfortable nosebag, left him to his meal. The young man, sitting on an upturned wooden case at the extreme edge of the elm tree shade, a slender easel before him, a litter of paraphernalia on the ground by his side, painted assiduously. Paul idly crept behind him and watched in amazement the smears of wet color, after a second or two of apparent irrelevance, take their place in the essential structure of the drawing. He stood absorbed. He knew that there were such things as pictures. He knew, too, that they were made by hands, but he had never seen one in the making. After a while, the artist threw back his head, looked at the inn, and looked at his sketch. There was a hot bit of thatch at the corner near the orchard, and below the eaves, bold shadow. The shadow had not come right. He put in a touch of burnt umber and again considered the effect. "Confound it, that's all wrong," he muttered. "It's blue," said Paul. The artist started, twisted his head, and for the first time became conscious of the ragamuffin's presence. "Oh, you see it blue, do you?" He smiled ironically. "Aye," said Paul, with pointing finger. "Look at it. It's not brown anyhow. Yon's black inside and blue outside." The young man shaded his brow and gazed intently. Brilliant sunshine plays the deuce with tones. "My hat," cried he. "You're right. It was this confounded yellow of the side of the house." He put in a few hasty strokes. "That better?" "Aye," said Paul. The artist laid down his brush and swung round on his box, clasping knees. "How the devil did you manage to see when I didn't?" "Dunno," said Paul. The young man stretched himself and lit a cigarette. "What are yo doing that for, mister?" Paul asked seriously. "That? Aye," said Paul. "You mun have a reason." "You're a queer infant," laughed the artist. "Do you really want to know?" "I've asked you," said Paul. "Well, if you're anxious to know, I'm an architect on a holiday, and I'm sketching any old thing I come across. I don't pretend to be a painter, my youthful virtuoso, and that's why I go wrong sometimes on color. Do you know what an architect is?" "No," said Paul eagerly. "What is that?" He had been baffled by the meaning of the word, which he had seen all his life inscribed on a brass plate in the Bloodstone High Street, E. Thompson, architect and surveyor. It had seemed to him odd, cryptically fascinating. The young man laughed and explained. Paul listened seriously. Another mystery was solved. He had often wondered how the bricklayers knew where to lay the bricks. He grasped the idea that they were but instruments carrying out the conception of the architect's brain. "I'd like to be an architect," he said. "Would you?" After a pause, the young man continued. "Anyhow, you can earn a shilling. Just sit down there and let me make a sketch of you." "What for?" asked Paul. "Because you're a picturesque person. Now I suppose you'll be asking me what's the meaning of picturesque." "Nay," said Paul, "I know. You've seen in books. The old grey tower stood out picturesque against the crimson sky." "Hullo, you're a literary gent," said the young man. "I," replied Paul proudly. He was greatly attracted towards this new acquaintance, whom, by his speech and dress and ease of manner, he judged to belong to the same caste as his long-lost but ever-remembered goddess. The young man picked up pencil and sketchbook and posed Paul at the end of the seat by the trestle table. "Now then," he said, setting to work, "head a little more that way, capital. Don't move. If you're very quiet, I'll give you a shilling." Presently he asked, "What are you? If you hadn't been a literary gent, I'd have thought you might be a gypsy." Paul flushed and started. "I'm not a gypsy." "Steady, steady," exclaimed the artist. "I've said you couldn't be one. Italian? You don't look English." For the first time, the idea of exotic parentage entered Paul's head. He dallied for a moment or two with the thought. "I don't know what I am," he said romantically. "Oh, what's your father?" the young man mentioned with his head towards the inn. "Yon's not my father," said Bill. "That's only Barney Bill." "Only Barney Bill?" echoed the other, amused. "Well, who is your father?" "Dunno," said Paul. "And your mother?" "Dunno either," said Paul in a mysterious tone. "I don't know if my parents are living or dead." "I think they're living." "That's interesting. What are you doing with what's-his-name Bill?" "I'm just traveling with him to London." "And what are you going to do in London?" "I'll see when I get there," said Paul. "So you're out for an adventure?" "Aye," said the boy, a gleam of the vision dancing before his eyes. "That's it. I'm going on an adventure." "There, keep like that," cried the artist. "Don't stir. I do believe I'm getting you. Holy Moses, it will be great. If only I could catch the expression. There's nothing like adventure, is there? The glorious uncertainty of it, to wake up in the morning and know that the unexpected is bound to happen during the day. Exciting, isn't it?" "Aye," said Paul, his face aglow. The young man worked tense and quick at the luminous eyes. He broke a long silence by asking, "What's your name?" "Paul Kegworthy." "Paul? That's odd. In the sphere of life to which the ragged urchin belonged, Toms and Bills and Jims were as thick as blackberries, but Paul's were rare." "What's odd?" said Paul. "Your name. How did you get it? It's uncommon." "I suppose it is," said Paul. "I've never thought of it. I never knew anybody of that name before." Here was another sign and token of romantic origin suddenly revealed. Paul felt the thrill of it. He resisted a temptation to ask his new friend whether it was an appellation generally reserved for princes. "Look here, joking apart," said the artist, putting in the waves of the thick black hair. "Are you really going to be dumped down in London to seek your fortune? Don't you know anybody there?" "No," said Paul. "How are you going to live?" Paul dived his hand into his breeches pocket and jingled coins. "I've got the brass," said he. "How much?" 3 shillings and 7 pence halfpenny, said Paul with an opulent air, "and your shilling will make it 4 and 7 pence halfpenny." "Good God," said the young man. He went on drawing for some time in silence. Then he said, "My brother is a painter, rather a swell, a royal academician. He would love to paint you, so would other fellows. You could easily earn your living as a model, doing as a business, you know, what you're doing now for fun, more or less." "How much could I earn?" "It all depends. Say £1 to 30 shillings a week." Paul gasped and sat paralyzed. Artists, dusty road, gaudy van, distant cornfields and uplands were blotted from the senses. The cool waves of Pactolus lapped his feet. "Come and look me up when you get to London," continued the friendly voice. "My name is Rowlett, W.W. Rowlett, 4 Gray's Inn Square. Can you remember it?" "Aye," said Paul. "Shall I write it down?" "Nay. W.W. Rowlett, 4 Gray's Inn Square. I'm known likely to forget it. I never forget now," said Paul, life returning through a vein of boastfulness. "Tell me all you remember," said Mr. Rowlett with a laugh. "I can say all the kings of England, with their dates and the counties and chief towns of Great Britain and Ireland, and all the weights and measures, and the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold." "Holy Moses," cried Rowlett. "Anything else?" "Aye, lots more," said Paul, anxious to stamp vividly the impression he saw that he was making. "I know the plagues of Egypt." "I bet you don't." "Rivers of blood, frogs, lice, flies, murrain, boils, hails, locusts, darkness, and death of firstborn," said Paul in a breath. "Jehoshaphat," cried Rowlett. "I suppose now you'd have no difficulty in reciting the 39 Articles." Paul puckered his forehead and thought. "Do you mean," he asked for a pause, "the 39 Articles of Religion, as in the prayer book? I had tried to read 'em, but could not understand 'em read." Rowlett, who had not expected his facetious query to be so answered, stopped his drawing for a moment. "What in the name of goodness attracted you to the 39 Articles?" "I wanted to learn about things," said Paul. The young man looked at him and smiled. "Self-education is a jolly good thing," said he. "Learn all you can and you'll be a famous fellow one of these days, but you must cultivate a sense of humor." Paul was about to seek enlightenment as to this counsel when Barney Bill appeared, cool and refreshed from the inn door, and lifted a cheery voice. "Let's be getting along, sonny." Rowlett held up a detaining hand. "Just a couple of minutes, if you can spare them. I'm nearly finished." "All right, sir," said Barney Bill, limping across the yard, taking a picture of him. The artist nodded. Barney Bill looked over his shoulders. "By gosh," he cried in admiration. "By gosh. It has come out rather well, hasn't it?" said the artist complacently. "It's the living image of him," said Barney Bill. "He tells me he's going up to London to seek his fortune," said Rowlett, putting in his finishing touches. "And his high-born parents," said Barney Bill, winking at Paul. Paul flushed and wriggled uncomfortably. Instinct deprecated crude revelation of the mystery of his birth to the man of refinement. He felt that Barney Bill was betraying his confidence. Gutter-bred though he was, he accused his vagrant protector of a lack of good taste. Of such a breach he himself, son of princes, could not have been guilty. Luckily, and as Paul thought, with admirable tact, Mr. Rowlett did not demand an explanation. A young Japhet in the search of a father. Well, I hope he'll find him. There's nothing like romance. Without it, life is flat and dead. It's what atmosphere is to a picture. And onions to a stew, said Barney Bill. Quite right, said Rowlett. Paul, my boy, I think after all you'd better stick to Mr. Barney Bill, sir, at your service. And if you want a comfortable chair or an elegant mat or a hearth brush or at a ridiculously cheap price, he waved toward the van. Rowlett turned his head and, laughing, looked into the twinkling black eyes. I don't for a moment expect you to buy, sir, but I was only satisfying my artistic conscience. Rowlett shut his sketchbook with a snap and rose. Let us have a drink, said he. Artists should be better acquainted. He whispered a message to Paul, who sped to the inn and presently returned with a couple of the famous blue and white mugs frothing deliciously at the brims. The men, their lips to the bubbles, nodded to each other. The still beat of the August noon enveloped their bodies, but a streak of heavenly coolness trickled through their souls. Paul, looking at them enviously, longed to be grown up. Then followed a pleasant half-hour of desultory talk. Although the men did not make him, save for here and there a casual reference, the subject of their conversation, Paul, with the vision shivering before his eyes, was sensitive enough to perceive in a dim and elusive way that he was at the back of each man's thoughts, and that for his sake each was trying to obtain the measure of the other. At last Barney Bill, cocking at the sun, the skilled eye of the dweller in the wilderness, called the time for departure. Could I see the picture? Asked Paul. Rowlett passed him the sketchbook. The sudden sight of oneself, as one appears in another's eyes, is always a shock, even in the most sophisticated sitter. To Paul, it was uncanny. He had often seen his own reflection and was familiar with his own appearance, but this was the first time that he had looked at himself impersonally. The sketch was vivid, the likeness excellent, the motive the picturesque and romantic. A proud lift of the chin, an eager glance in the eye, a sensitive curve of the lip attracted his boyish egotism. The portrait was an ideal, something to live up to. Involuntarily, he composed his features. Barney Bill again called time. Paul surrendered the sketchbook reluctantly. Rowlett, with a cheery word, handed him the shilling fee. Paul, than whom none better knew the magic quality of money, hesitated for a second. The boy in the sketch would have refused. Paul drew himself up. "Nay, I'll take none. I like doing it." Rowlett laughed and pocketed the coin. "All right," said he, with a playful bow. "I'm exceedingly indebted to your courtesy." Barney Bill gave Paul an approving glance. "Good for you, boy. Never take money you've not earned. Good day to you, sir." He touched his cap, and, with a motion toward the empty mugs, "Thank you kindly." Rowlett strolled with them to the van, Barney Bill limping a pace or two ahead. "Remember what I told you, my young friend," said he in a low voice. "I don't go back upon my word. I'll help you. But if you're a wise boy and know what's good for you, you'll stick to Mr. Barney Bill and the freedom of the high road and the light heart of the vagabond. You'll have a devilish sight more happiness in the end." But Paul, who already looked upon his gypsy self as dead as his bloodstained self, and these dead selves as stepping stones to higher things, turned a deaf ear to his new friend's paradoxical philosophy. "I remember," said he, "Mr. W. Rowlett, 4, Grey Square Inn." The young architect watched the van with its swinging, creaking excrescences lumber away down the hot and dusty road, and turned with a puzzled expression to his easel. Joy in the Little Bear Inn had for the moment departed. Presently he found himself scribbling a letter in pencil to his brother, the Royal Academician. "So you see, my dear fellow," he wrote toward the end of the epistle, "I am in a quandary. That the little beggar is of startling beauty is undeniable. That he has got his bill agape, like a young bird, for whatever food of beauty and emotion and knowledge comes his way is obvious to any fool. But whether, in what I propose, I'm giving a helping hand to a kind of wild genius, or whether I'm starting a vain boy along the primrose path in the direction of everlasting bonfire, I'm damned if I know." But Paul jogged along by the side of Barney Bill in no such state of dubiety. God was in his heaven, arranging everything for his especial benefit. All was well with the world, where dazzling destinies like his were bound to be fulfilled. "I've heard of such things," said Barney Bill, with a reflective twist of his head, when Paul told him of Mr. Rowlett's suggestion. "A cousin of mine married a man who knew a gal who used to stand in her birthday suit in front of a lot of young painter chaps, and I'm bound to say he used to declare she was as good a gal as his own wife, especially seeing as how she supported an old father that had got a stroke, and a house full of young brothers and sisters. So I'm not saying there's any harm in it, and I wouldn't stand in your way, sonny, seeing as how you want to get to your high-born parents. You might find him on the road, and then again you mightn't, and 30 bob a week at 14, no, it would be flying in the face of Providence to say don't do it. But what licks me is, what the blazes do they want with a little varmint like you? Why shouldn't they pay 30 bob a week to paint me?" Paul did not reply, being instinctively averse from wounding susceptibilities, but in his heart rose a high pity for the common, though kindly clay that was Barney Bill. End of chapter 4. Recording by Danny Hogger, Fullerton, California. Danny Hogger Podcast, www.dannyhogger.com.
Chapter 5 of The Fortunate Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carl Henning. The Fortunate Youth by William John Locke. Chapter 5. When they reached London in November after circuitous wanderings, Barney Bill said to Paul, "You've seed enough of me, matey, to know that I wished yer good and not harm. I've fed yer, and I've housed yer. I can't say as how I've done much toward clothing yer, and 3 months on the road has knocked corners off the swell toggery yer came to me in. But I ain't beat yer, or cost you more than you deserved." Whereat Paul grinned. "And I've spent a lot of valuable time when I might have been profitably doing nothing a learning you of things and, so to speak, completing your education. Is that the truth, or am I a bloomin' liar?" Paul, thus challenged, confirmed the absolute veracity of Barney Bill's statement. The latter continued, bending forward, his lean brown hand on the boy's shoulder and looking at him earnestly. "I took you away from your happy home because, though the home might have been happy in its own sweet way, you wasn't. I wanted to set you on the track of your high-born parents. I wanted to make a man of you. I wanted to do the best for you now, so I put it to you straight. If you likes to come along of me altogether, I'll pay your wages on the next round, and when you gets a little older, I'll take you into partnership and leave you the business when I die. It's a man's life, and a free life, and I think you likes it, don't you?" "Aye," said Paul, "it's fine. On the other hand, as I said afore, I won't stand in your way, and if you thinks you'll get nearer to your high-born parents by hitching up with Mr. Architect, well, you're old enough to choose. I'll leave it to you." But Paul had already chosen. The road had its magical fascination, to which he would have surrendered all his boyish soul, had not the call of his destiny been more insistent. The road led now hither. Princes and princesses were as rare as hips and haws in summertime. Their glittering equipages did not stop the van, nor did they stand at the emblazoned gateways of great parks, waiting patiently for long-lost sons. He knew that he must seek them in their own social world, and to this he would surely be raised by his phantasmagorial income of 30 shillings a week. "You won't object to my keeping a friendly eye on you for the next year or two?" asked Barney Bill, with twisted mouth and a kindly satirical glance. Paul flushed. He had the consciousness of being a selfish, self-centered little beast, not half enough grateful to Barney Bill for delivering him out of the house of bondage and leading him into the land of milk and honey. He was as much stung by the delicately implied rebuke as touched by the solicitude as to his future welfare. Romantic words such as he had read in the storybooks surged vaguely in his head, but he could find none to utter. He kept silent for a few moments, his hand in his breeches pocket. Presently he drew it forth rather slowly and held out the precious cornelian heart to his benefactor. "I'd like to give it to thee," said Paul. Barney Bill took it. "Thank you, sonny. I'll remember that you gave it to me, but I won't keep your talisman. Here, see?" He made a pretense to spit on it. "That's for luck. Barney Bill's luck. And good wishes." So Paul pocketed the heart again, immensely relieved by his friend's magnanimity, and the little sentimental episode was over. A month later, when Barney Bill started on his solitary winter pilgrimage in the south of England, he left behind him a transmogrified Paul. A Paul, thanks to his munificence, arrayed in decent garments, including collar and tie, insignia of caste, and an overcoat, symbol of luxury, for which Paul was to repay him out of his future earnings. A Paul lodged in a small but comfortable third-floor back, a bedroom all to himself, with a real bed, mattress, pillow, sheets, and blankets all complete, and a looking-glass, and a stand with ewer and basin so beautiful that, at first, Paul did not dare wash for fear of making the water dirty. A Paul already engaged for a series of sittings by Mr. Cyrus Roulat, R.A., his head swimming with the wonder of the fashionable painter's studio, a Paul standing in radiant confidence upon the brink of life. "Sonny," said Barney Bill when he said goodbye, "d'yer see them there lovely lace-up boots you've got on?" "Aye," said Paul, regarding them complacently. "Well, they've got to take you all the way up the hill, like the young man, what's his name? Excelsior, in the piece of poetry you recite, but they'll only do it if they continues to fit. Don't get too big for 'em. At any rate, wait till they're worn out, and you can buy another pair with your own money." Paul grinned because he did not know what else to do. So, as to show his intellectual appreciation of the parable, but in his heart, for all his gratitude, he thought Barney Bill rather a prosy moralizer. It was one of the disabilities of advanced old age. Alas, what can bridge the gulf between 14 and 50? "Anyhow, you've got a friend at the back of you, sonny, and don't make no mistake about it. If you're in trouble, let me know. I can't say fairer than that, can I?" That, for a season, was the end of Barney Bill, and Paul found himself thrillingly alone in London. At first, its labyrinthine vastness overwhelmed him, causing him to feel an unimportant atom, which may have been good for his soul, but was not agreeable to his vanity. By degrees, however, he learned the lay of the great thoroughfares, especially those leading to the quarters where artists congregate, and, conscious of purpose and of money jingling in his pocket, he began to hold his head high in the crowded streets. In the house in Barn Street, off the Euston Road where he lodged, he was called Mr. Paul by his landlady, Miss Seddon, and her 13-year-old daughter, Jane, which was comforting and stimulating. Jane, a lanky, fair, blue-eyed girl who gave promise of good looks, attended to his modest wants with a zeal somewhat out of proportion to the payment received. Paul had the novel sensation of finding someone at his beck and call. He beckoned and called often, for the sheer pleasure of it. So great was the change in his life that, in these early days, it seemed as if he had already come into his kingdom. He strutted about, poor child, like the prince in a fairy tale, and, in spite of Barney Bill's precepts, he outgrew his boots immediately. Miss Seddon, an old friend of Barney Bill, whom she addressed and spoke as Mr. William, kept a small shop in which she sold newspapers and twine and penny bottles of ink. In the little back parlor, Miss Seddon and Tane and Paul had their meals, while the shop boy, an inconsiderable creature with a perpetual cold in his head, attended the unexpected customer. To Paul, this boy, with whom a few months ago he would have joyously changed places, was as the dust beneath his feet. He sent him on errands in a lordly way, treating him as, indeed, he had treated the youth of Budge Street after his triumph over Billy Goodge, and the boy obeyed meekly. Paul believed in himself. The boy didn't. Almost from the beginning he usurped an ascendancy over the little household. For all their having lived in the great maelstrom of London, he found his superficial experience of life larger than that of mother and daughter. They had never seen machinery at work, did not know the difference between an elm and a beech, and had never read Sir Walter Scott. Miss Seddon, thin, careworn, and slackly good-natured, ever lamented the loss of an astonishingly brilliant husband. Jane was markedly the more competent of the two. She had character, and even while slaving for the romantic youth, made it clear to him that for no other man alive would she so demean herself. Paul resolved to undertake her education. The months slipped by golden with fulfillment. News of the beautiful boy model went the round of the studios. Those were simpler times, although not so very long ago, in British art than the present, and the pretty picture was still in vogue. As Mr. Roulat, the young architect, had foretold, Paul had no difficulty in obtaining work. Indeed, it was fatally easy. Mr. Cyrus Roulat, R.A., had launched him. Being fabulously paid, he thought his new profession the most aristocratic calling in the world. In a remarkably short time, he was able to repay Barney Bill. The day when he purchased the postal order was the proudest in his life. The transaction gave him a princely feeling. He alone of boys, by special virtue of his origin, was capable of such a thing. Again, his welcome in the painting world confirmed him in the belief that he was a personage, born to great things. Posed on the model throne, the object of the painter's intense scrutiny, he swelled ingeniously with the conviction of his supreme importance. The lazy luxury of the model's life appealed to his sensuous temperament. He loved the warmth, the artistic setting of the studios, the pictures, the oriental rugs, the bits of armor, the old brocade, the rich cushions. If he had not been born to it, why had he not remained? Like all the youth of Bludston, amid the filth and clatter of the factory, he loved, too, to hear the studio talk, though at first he comprehended little of it. The men and women for whom he sat possessed the same quality as his never-forgotten goddess, and Lady Chudley and the young architect, a quality which he recognized keenly, but for which his limited vocabulary could find no definition. Afterward, he realized that it was refinement in manner and speech and person. This quality he felt it essential to acquire. Accordingly, he played the young ape to those who aroused his admiration. One day, when Jane entered the back parlor, he sprang from his seat and advanced with outstretched hand to meet her. "My dear Lady Jane, how good of you to come. Do let me clear a chair for you." "What are you playing at?" asked Jane. "That's the way to receive a lady when she calls on you." "Oh," said Jane. He practiced on her each newly learned social accomplishment. He minced his broad Lancashire when he spoke to her in such a way as to be grotesquely unintelligible. By listening to conversations, he learned many amazing social facts, among them that the gentry had a bath every morning of their lives. This stirred his imagination to such a pitch that he commanded Jane to bring up the matutinal washtub to his bedroom. By instinct refined, he reveled in the resultant sensation of cleanliness. He paid great attention to his attire, modeling himself, as far as he could, on young Rolla, the architect, on whom he occasionally called to report progress. He bought such neckties and collars as Roulat wore and submitted them for Jane's approval. She thought them vastly genteel. He also entertained her with whatever jargon of art talk he managed to pick up. Thus, though the urchin gave himself airs and invested himself with affections which rendered him intolerable to all of his own social status, except the placid Miss Seddon and the adoring Jane, he was under the continuous influence of a high ambition. It made him ridiculous, but it preserved him from vicious and vulgar things. If you are conscious of being a prince in disguise, qualifying for butterfly entrance into your kingdom, it behooves you to behave in a princely manner, not to consort with lewd fellows and not to neglect opportunities for education. You owe to yourself all the good that you can extract from the world. Acting from this point of view, and guided by the practical advice of young Roulat, he attended evening classes, where he gulped down knowledge hungrily. So what with sitting and studying and backward and forward journeying and educating Jane and practicing the accomplishments of a prince and sleeping the long sound sleep of a tired youngster, Paul had no time to think of evil. He was far too much absorbed in himself. Meanwhile, of Bludston not a sign. For all that he had heard of search being made for him, he might have been a runaway kitten. Sometimes he wondered what steps the Buttons had taken in order to find him. If they had communicated with the police, surely at some stage of their journey, Barney Bill would have been held up and questioned. But had they even troubled to call in the police? Barney Bill thought not, and Paul agreed. The police were very unpopular in Budge Street, almost as unpopular as Paul. In all probability, the Buttons were only too glad to be rid of him. If he found no favor in the eyes of Miss Button, in the eyes of Button he was detestable. Occasionally he spoke of them to Barney Bill on his rare appearances in London, but for prudential motives the latter had struck Bludston out of his itinerary and could give no information. At last Paul ceased altogether to think of them. They belonged to a far distant past, already becoming blurred in his memory. So Paul lived his queer, sedulous life, month after month, year after year, known among the studios as a quaint oddity, drawn out indulgently by the men, somewhat petted, monkey fashion, by the women, forgotten by both when out of their presence, but developing imperceptibly day by day along the self-centering line. A kindly advisor suggested a gymnasium to keep him in condition for professional purposes. He took the advice, and in the course of time became a splendid young animal, a being so physically perfect as to be what the good vicar of Bludston had called him in tired jest, a luscious nature. But though proud of his body as any finely formed human may honorably be, a far higher arrogance saved him from Narcissus vanity. It was the inner and essential Paul, and not the outer investiture, that was born to great things. In his 18th year, he gradually awoke to consciousness of change. One of his classmates at the Polytechnic Institute, with whom he had picked a slight acquaintance, said one evening as they were walking homeward together, "I shan't be coming here after next week. I've got a good clerkship in the city. What are you doing?" "I'm an artist model," said Paul. The other, a pale and perky youth, sniffed. His name was Higgins. "Good Lord, what do you mean?" "I'm a model in the life class of the Royal Academy School," said Paul proudly. "You stand up naked in front of all kinds of people for them to paint you." "Of course," said Paul. "How beastly," said Higgins. "What do you mean?" "Just that," said Higgins. "It's beastly." A minute or two afterward, he jumped on a passing omnibus and thenceforward avoided Paul at the Polytechnic Institute. This uncompromising pronouncement on the part of Higgins was a shock. But together with other incidents, chiefly psychological, vague, intangible phenomena of his spiritual development, it showed Paul the possibility of another point of view. He took stock of himself, from the picturesque boy he had grown into the physically perfect man. As a model, he was no longer sought after for subject pieces. He was in clamorous demand at life schools, where he drew a higher rate of pay, but where he was as impersonal to the intently working students as the cast of the Greek torso which other students were copying in the next room. The intimacy of the studio, the warmth and the color, and the meretricious luxury were gone from his life. On the other hand, he was making money. He had £50 in the savings bank, the maximum of petty thrift which an incomprehensive British government encourages, and a fair, though unknown, sum in an iron money box hidden behind his washstand. Up to now, he had had no time to learn how to spend money. When he took to smoking cigarettes, which he had done quite recently, he regarded himself as a man. Higgins's "how beastly" rang in his head. Although he could not quite understand the full meaning of the brutal judgment, it brought him disquiet and discontent. For one thing, like the high road, his profession led now hither. The thrill of adventure had gone from it. It was static, and Paul's temperament was dynamic. He had also lost his boyish sense of importance, of being the central figure in the little stage. Disillusion began to creep over him. Would he do nothing else but this all his life? Old Ericone, the patriarchal, white-bearded Italian, the doyen of the models of London, came before his mind, a senile posturer, mumbling dreary tales of his inglorious achievements, how he was the Roman emperor in this picture and Father Abraham in the other, how painters could not get on without him, how once he had been summoned from Rome to London, how Rossetti had shaken hands with him. Paul shivered at the thought of himself as the Ericone of a future generation. The next day was Saturday, and he had no sitting. The morning he spent in his small bedroom in the soothing throes of literary composition. Some time ago he had thought it would be a mighty fine thing to be a poet, and he had tried his hand at verse. Finding he possessed some facility, he decided that he was a poet, and at once started an epic poem in rhyme on the life of Nelson, the material being supplied by Southey. This morning he did the Battle of the Baltic. He put the glass to his blind eye and said, "No signals do I spy," wrote Paul. Poetry taken at the gallop like this was a very simple affair, and Paul covered an amazing amount of ground. In the afternoon he walked abroad with Jane, who, having lengthened her skirts and put up her hair, was now a young woman looking older than her years. She too had developed. Her lank figure had rounded into pretty curves. Her sharp little cockney face had filled out. She had a pleasant smile and a capable brow, and, correcting the tendency to fluffiness of hair of which she disapproved, and dressing herself neatly, made herself by no means unattractive. Constant association with Paul had fired her ambitions. Like him, she might have a destiny, though not such a majestic one. Accordingly, she had studied stenography and typewriting, with a view to earning her livelihood away from the little shop, which did not offer the prospect of a dazzling career. At the back of her girlish mind was the desire to keep pace with Paul in his upward flight, so that he should not be ashamed of her when he sat upon the clouds in glory. In awful secrecy she practiced the social accomplishments which Paul brought home. She loved her Saturday and Sunday excursions with Paul. Of late they had gone far afield, the Tower, Greenwich, Richmond, exploring London and making splendid discoveries such as Westminster Abbey and a fourpenny tea garden at Putney. She scarcely knew whether she cared for these things for themselves, but she saw them through Paul, coloured by his vivid personality. Once, on Chelsea Bridge, he had pointed out a peculiarly ugly stretch of low-tide mud and said, "Look at that!" She, by unprecedented chance, mistaking his tone, had replied, "How lovely!" And she had thought it lovely, until his stare of rebuke and wonderment brought disillusion and spurting tears, which for the life of him he could not understand. It is very foolish, and often suicidal, of men to correct women for going into rapture over mudflats. On that occasion, however, the only resultant harm was the conviction in the girl's heart that the presence of Paul turned mudflats into beds of asphodel. Then, just as she saw outer things through his eyes, she felt herself regarded by outer eyes through him. His rare and absurd beauty made him a cynosure whithersoever he went. London, vast and seething, could produce no such perfect Apollo. When she caught the admiring glances of others of her sex, little Jane drew herself up proudly and threw back insolent glances of triumph. "You would like to be where I am, wouldn't you?" the glance would say, with the words almost formulated in her mind. "But you won't. You never will be. I've got him. He's walking out with me and not with you. I like to see you squirm, you envious little cat." Jane was not a princess. She was merely a child of the people, but I am willing to eat my boots if it can be satisfactorily proved that there is a princess living on the face of the earth who would not be delighted at seeing another woman cast covetous eyes on the man she loved, and would not call her a cat, or its homonym, for doing so. On this mild March afternoon, Paul and Jane walked in the Euston Road, he in a loose blue serge suit, floppy black tie, low collar, and black soft felt hat. This was in the last century, please remember. Epoch almost romantic, so fast does time fly. She in neat black braided jacket and sailor hat. They looked pathetically young. "Where shall we go?" asked Jane. Paul, in no mood for high adventure, suggested Regent's Park. "At least we can breathe there," said he. Jane sniffed up the fresh spring air, unconscious of the London taint, and laughed. "Why, what's the matter with the Euston Road?" "It's vulgar," said Paul. In the park, the hyacinths and the daffodils will be out." What he meant he scarcely knew. When one is very young and out of tune with life, one is apt to speak discordantly. They mounted a westward omnibus. Paul lit a cigarette and smoked almost in silence until they alighted by the park gates. As they entered, he turned to her suddenly. "Look here, Jane, I want to ask you something. The other night, I told a man I was an artist model, and he said, 'How beastly,' and turned away as if I wasn't fit for him to associate with. What was he driving at?" "He was a nasty cad," said Jane promptly. "Of course he was," said Paul. "But why did he say it? Do you think there's anything beastly in being a model?" "Certainly not," she added in modification. "That is, if you like it." "Well, supposing I don't like it?" She did not reply for a minute or two. Then, "If you really don't like it, I should be rather glad." "Why?" asked Paul. She raised a piteous face. "You tell me," he insisted. "Tell me why you agree with that cad Higgins." "I don't agree with him." "You must." They fenced for a while. At last he pinned her down. "Well, if you want to know," she declared with a flushed cheek, "I don't think it's a man's job." He bit his lip. He had asked for the truth, and he had got it. His own dark suspicions were confirmed. Jane glanced at him, fearful of offence. When they had walked some yards, he spoke. "What would you call a man's job?" Jane hesitated for an answer. Her life had been passed in a sphere where men carpentered, or drove horses, or sold things in shops. Deeply impressed by the knowledge of Paul's romantic birth and high destiny, she could not suggest any such lowly avocations, and she did not know what men's jobs were usually executed by scions of the nobility. A clerk's work was certainly genteel, but even that would be lowering to the hero. She glanced at him again swiftly. No, he was too beautiful to be penned up in an office from 9 to 6:30 every day of his life. On the other hand, her feminine intuition appreciated keenly the withering criticism of Higgins. Ever since Paul had first told her of his engagements at the life schools, she had shrunk from the idea. It was all very well for the boy, but for the man. And being younger than he, she regarded him now as a man. There was something in it that offended her nice sense of human dignity. "Well," he said, "tell me, what do you call a man's job?" "Oh, I don't know," she said in distress. "Something you do with your hands or your brain." "You think being a model is undignified?" "Yes." "So do I," said Paul. "But I'm doing things with my brain too, you know," he added quickly, anxious to be seen again on his pedestal. "I'm getting on with my epic poem. I've done a lot since you last heard it. I'll read you the rest when we get home." "That will be lovely," said Jane, to whom the faculty of rhyming was a never-ceasing wonder. She would sit bemused by the jingling lines and wrapped in awe at the minstrel. They sat on a bench by the flower beds, gay in their spring charm of belated crocus and hyacinth and daffodil, with here and there a precocious tulip. Paul, sensitive to beauty, discoursed on flowers. Max Field had a studio in St. John's Wood opening out into a garden, which last summer was a dream of delight. He described it. When he came into his kingdom, he intended to have such a garden. "You'll let me have a peep at it sometimes, won't you?" said Jane. "Of course," said Paul. The lack of enthusiasm in his tone chilled the girl's heart, but she did not protest. In these days, in spite of occasional outspokenness, she was still a humble little girl, worshipping her brilliant companion from afar. "How often could I come?" she asked. "That," said he in his boyish pashadom, "would depend on how good you were." Obedient to the thought process of her sex, she made a beeline to the particular. "Oh, Paul, I hope you're not angry." "At what?" "At what I said about your being a model." "Not a bit," said he. "If I hadn't wanted to know your opinion, I wouldn't have asked you." She brightened. "You really wanted to know what I thought?" "Naturally," said Paul. "You're the most common-sense girl I've ever met." Paul walked soberly home. Jane accompanied him, on wings. On Monday, Paul went to the life school and stripped with a heavy heart. Jane was right. It was not a man's job. The fact, too, of his doing it lowered him in her esteem, and though he had no romantic thoughts whatever with regard to Jane, he enjoyed being Lord Paramount in her eyes. He went into the studio and took up his pose, and as he stood on the model throne conspicuous, glaring, the one startling central object, Higgins's "How beastly!" came like a material echo and smote him in the face. He felt like Adam when he first proceeded to his primitive tailoring. A wave of shame ran through him. He looked around the great silent room at the rows of students, each in front of an easel, using his naked body for their purposes. A phrase flashed across his mind. In 3 years his reading had brought vocabulary. They were using his physical body for their spiritual purposes. For the moment he hated them all fiercely. They were a band of vampires. Habit and discipline alone saved him from breaking his pose and fleeing headlong. But there he was fixed, like marble, in an athlete's attitude, showing rippling muscles of neck and chest and arms and thighs, all developed by the gymnasium into the perfection of Greek beauty, and all useless, more useless even as far as the world's work was concerned than the muscles of a racehorse. There he was fixed, with outstretched limbs and strained loins, a human being far more alive than the peering, measuring throng, far more important, called by a destiny infinitely higher than theirs. And none of them suspected it. For the first time he saw himself as they saw him. They admired him as a thing, an animal trained especially for them, a prize bullock. As a human being they disregarded him. Nay, in the depths of their hearts they despised him. Not one of them would have stood where he did. He would have considered it, rightly, as degrading to his manhood. The head of the school snapped his fingers impatiently and fussed up to the model stand. "What's the matter? Tired already? Take it easy for a minute, if you like." "No," said Paul, instinctively stiffening himself. "I'm never tired." It was his boast that he could stand longer in a given pose than any other model, and thereby he had earned reputation. "Then don't go to pieces, my boy," said the head of the school, not unkindly. "You're supposed to be a great athlete and not Venus rising from the sea or a jelly at a children's party." Paul flushed all over, and insane anger shook him. How dared the man speak to him like that? He kept the pose, thinking wild thoughts. Every moment the strain grew less bearable, the consciousness of his degradation more intense. He longed for something to happen, something dramatic, something that would show the vampires what manner of man he was. He was histrionic in his anguish. A fly settled on his back, a damp, sluggish fly that had survived the winter, and it crawled horribly up his spine. He bore it for a few moments, and then his overexcited nerves gave way and he dashed his hand behind him. Somebody laughed. He raised his clenched fist and glared at the class. You can laugh till you bust," he cried, falling back into his Lancashire accent. "But you'll never see me here again. Never, never, never. So help me God." He rushed away. The head of the school followed him, and, while he was dressing, reasoned with him. "Nay," said Paul, "ne'er again. I'm done with the whole business." And as Paul walked home through the hurrying streets, He thought regretfully of 20 speeches which would have more adequately signified his indignant retirement from the profession. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Carl Henning.
Chapter 6 of The Fortunate Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonali Punja. The Fortunate Youth by William John Locke. Chapter 6. Paul's model self being dead, he regarded it with complacency and set his foot on it, little doubting that it was another stepping stone. He spoke loftily of his independence. "But how are you going to earn your living?" asked Jane, the practical. "I shall follow one of the arts," Paul replied. "I think I am a poet, but I might be a painter or a musician." "You do sing and play lovely," said Jane. He had recently purchased from a pawn shop a second-hand mandolin, which he had mastered by the aid of a 6-penny handbook, and he would play on it accompaniments to sentimental ballads, which he sang in a high baritone. "I will not choose yet awhile," said Paul, disregarding the tribute. "Something will happen. The moving finger will point." "What moving finger?" "The finger of destiny," said Paul. And as the superb youth predicted, something did happen a day or two afterwards. They were walking in Regent Street and stopped, as was their wont, before a photographer's window where portraits of celebrities were exposed to view. Paul loved this window, had loved it from the moment of discovery a couple of years before. It was a temple of fame. The fact of your portrait being exhibited, with your style and title printed below, marked you as one of the great ones of the earth. Often he had said to Jane, "Where I am, there you'll be proud, won't you?" And she had looked up to him adoringly and wondered why he was not there already. It was Paul's habit to scrutinize the faces of those who had achieved greatness: archbishops, field marshals, cabinet ministers, and to speculate on the quality of mind that had raised them to their high estate. And often he would shift his position so as to obtain a glimpse of his own features in the plate glass window and compare them with those of the famous. And thus he would determine that he had the brow of the divine, the nose of the statesman, and the firm lips of the soldier. It was a stimulating pastime. He was born to great things, but to what great things he knew not. The sphere in which his glory should be fulfilled was as yet hidden in the mists of time. But this morning, instead of roving over the illustrious gallery, his eye caught and was fascinated by a single portrait. He stood staring at it for a long time, lost in the thrill of thought. At last Jane touched his arm. "What are you looking at?" He pointed. "Do you see that?" "Yes, it's She named an eminent actor, then in the heyday of his fame, of whom legend hath it that his photographs were bought in thousands by lovelorn maidens who slept with them beneath their pillows. Paul drew her away from the little knot of idlers clustered round the window. "There's nothing that man can do that I can't do," said Paul. "You are 20 times better looking," said Jane. "I have more intelligence," said Paul. "Of course," said Jane. "I'm going to be an actor," said Paul. "Oh!" cried Jane in sudden rapture. Then her sturdy common sense asserted itself. "But can you act?" "I'm sure I could if I tried. You've only got to have the genius to start with, and the rest is easy." And she did not dare question his genius. She remained silent. "I'm going to be an actor," said he. and when I'm not acting, I shall be a poet." In spite of her adoration, Jane could not forbear a shaft of raillery. "You'll leave yourself some time to be a musician, won't you?" He laughed. His alert and retentive mind had seized long ago on Rowlatt's recommendation at the Little Bear Inn, and he had developed, perhaps half consciously, a half sense of humour. A whole sense, however, is not congruous with the fervid beliefs and soaring ambitions of 18. Your sense of humour, that delicate percipience of proportion, that subterranean check on impulse, that touch of the divine fellowship with human frailty, is a thing of the mellower growth. It is a solvent and not an excitant. It does not stimulate to sublime effort, but it can cool raging passion. It can take the salt from tears, the bitterness from judgment, the keenness from despair. But in its universal manifestation, it would effectually stop a naval engagement. Paul laughed. "You must think I brag too much, Jane," said he. "For anybody else I know, what I say would be ridiculous. But for me it is different. I am going to be a great man. I know it. If I'm not going to be a great actor, I shall be a great something else. God doesn't put such things into people's head for nothing. He didn't take me from the factory in Bludston and set me here with you, walking up Regent Street like a gentleman, just to throw me back into the gutter." "But who said you were going back to the gutter?" asked Jane. "Nobody. I wanted to get right with myself. But that getting right with oneself, do you think it is egoistic?" "I don't quite know what that is." He defined the term. "No," she said seriously, "I don't think it is. Everybody has got a self to consider. I don't look on it as ego, what do you call it? To strike out for myself instead of going on helping mother to mind the shop. So why should you? Besides, I owe a duty to my parents, don't I?" he asked eagerly. But here Jane took her own line. "I can't see that you do, considering that they have done nothing for you." "They have done everything for me," he protested vehemently. "They have made me what I am." "They didn't take much trouble about it," said Jane. They squabbled for a while after the manner of boy and girl. At last she cried, "Don't you see I'm proud of you for yourself and not for your silly old parents? What have they got to do with me? And besides, you'll never find them." "I don't think you know what you're talking about," he said loftily. "It is time we were getting home." He walked on for some time stiffly, his head in the air, not condescending to speak. She had uttered blasphemy. He would find his parents, he vowed to himself, if only to spite Jane. Presently, his ear caught a little sniff, and looking down, saw her dabbing her eyes with her handkerchief. His heart softened at once. "Never mind," said he. "You didn't mean it." "It's only because I love you, Paul," she murmured wretchedly. "That's all right," he said. "Let's go in here. They were passing a confectioner's, and we will have some jam puffs." Paul went to his friend Rowlatt, who had already heard, through one of his assistants who had a friend in the life school, of the dramatic end of the model's career. "I quite sympathize with you," Rowlatt laughed. "I've wondered how you stuck it so long. What are you going to do now?" "I'm going on the stage." "How are you going to get there?" "I don't know," said Paul. "But if I knew an actor, he would be able to tell me. I thought perhaps you might know an actor." "I do, one or two," replied Rowlatt. "But they're just ordinary actors, not managers. And I shouldn't think they'd be able to do anything for you. Except what I say," Paul persisted. "They'll tell me how one sets about being an actor." Rowlatt scribbled a couple of introductions on visiting cards, and Paul went away satisfied. He called on the two actors. The first, in atrabiliar mood, advised him to sweep crossings, black shoes, break stones by the roadside, cart manure, sell tripe or stocks and shares, blow out his brains rather than enter a profession over whose portals was inscribed the legend Laciate omne speranza. He snapped his finger and thumb to summon memory as if it were a dog. Voi che intrate, continued Paul, delighted at showing off the one Italian tag he had picked up from his reading. And filled with one of the purest joys of the young literary life, and therefore untouched by pessimistic counsel, he left the despairing actor. The second, a brighter and more successful man, talked with Paul for a long time about all manner of things. Having no notion of his antecedents, he assumed him to be a friend of Rowlatt and met him on terms of social equality. Paul expanded like a flower to the sun. It was the first time he had spoken with an educated man on common ground, a man to whom the great imaginative English writers were familiar friends, who ran from Chaucer to Lamb and from Dryden to Browning with amazing facility. The strong wine of elusive talk mounted to Paul's brain. Tingling with excitement, he brought out all his small artillery of scholarship and acquitted himself so well that his host sent him off with a cordial letter to a manager of his acquaintance. The letter opened the difficult door of the theatre. His absurd beauty of face and figure, a far greater recommendation in the eyes of the manager who had begun rehearsals for an elaborate romantic production, than a knowledge of the Fairy Queen, obtained for him an immediate engagement to walk on as a gilded youth of Italy in 2 or 3 scenes at a salary of 30 shillings a week. Paul went home and spread himself like a young peacock before Jane and said, "I am an actor." The girl's eyes glowed. "You are wonderful." "No, not I," replied Paul modestly. "It is my star." "Have you got a big part?" asked Jane. He laughed pityingly, sweeping back his black curls. "No, you silly. I haven't any lines to speak." He had at once caught up the phrase. "I must begin at the beginning. Every actor has to do it." "You will get Mother and me orders to come and see you, won't you?" "You shall have a box," declared Paul the Magnificent. Thus began a new phase in the career of Paul Kegworthy. After the first few days of bewilderment on the bare, bleak stage, where oddments of dilapidated furniture served to indicate thrones and staircases and palace doors and mossy banks, where men and women in ordinary costume behaved towards one another in the most ridiculous way, and went through unintelligible actions with phantom properties, where the actor-manager would pause in the breath of an impassioned utterance and cry out, "Oh my God, stop that hammering!" Where nothing looked the least bit in the world like the lovely ordered picture he had been accustomed to delight in from the shilling gallery. After the first few days, he began to focus this strange world and to suffer its fascination. And he was proud of the silent part allotted to him, a lazy lute player in attendance on the great lady, who lounged about on terrace steps in picturesque attitudes. He was glad that he was not an unimportant member of the crowd of courtiers who came on in a bunch and bowed and nodded and pretended to talk to one another and went off again. He realized that he would be in sight of the audience all the time. It did not strike him that the manager was using him merely as a piece of decoration. One day, however, at the rehearsal, the leading lady said, "If my lute player could play a few chords here, or the orchestra for him, it would help me tremendously. I've got all this long cross with nothing to say." Paul seized his opportunity. "I can play the mandolin," said he. "Oh, can you?" said the manager, and Paul was handed over to the musical director, and the next day rehearsed with a real instrument which he twanged in the manner prescribed. He did not fail to announce himself to Jane as a musician. Gradually, he found his feet among the heterogeneous band who walk on at London theatres. Some were, frankly, vulgar. Some were pretentiously genteel. A good many were young men of gentle birth from the public schools and universities. Paul's infallible instinct drew him into timid companionship with the last. He knew little of the things they talked about, golf and cricket prospects, and the then brain-baffling Ibsen. But he listened modestly, hoping to learn. He reaped the advantage of having played the sedulous ape to his patrons of the studios. His tricks were somewhat exaggerated. His sweep of the hat when ladies passed him at the stage door entrance was lower than custom deems necessary. He was quicker in courteous gesture than the young men from the universities. He bowed more deferentially to an interlocutor than is customary outside court circles. But they were all the tricks of good breeding. More than one girl asked if he were of foreign extraction. He remembered Rowlatt's question of years ago, and, as then, he felt curiously pleased. He confessed to an exotic strain, to Italian origin. Italy was romantic. When he obtained a line part and he appeared on the bill, he took the opportunity of changing a name linked with unpleasant associations which he did not regard as his own. Kegworthy was cast into the limbo of common things, and he became Paul Savelli, but this was later. He made friends at the theatre. Some of the women, by petting and flattery, did their best to spoil him. But Paul was too ambitious, too much absorbed in his dream of greatness and his dilettante literary and musical pursuits, too much yet of a boy to be greatly affected. What he prized far more highly than feminine blandishments was the new comradeship with his own sex. Instinctively he sought them, as a sick dog seeks grass, unconsciously feeling the need of them in his mental and moral development. Besides, the attitude of the women reminded him of that of the women painters in his younger days. He had no intention of playing the pet monkey again. His masculinity revolted. The young barbarian clamoured. A hard day on the river, he found much more to his taste than sporting in the shade of a Kensington flat over tea and sandwiches with no matter how sentimental an amaryllis. Jane, who had seen the performance, though not from a box, a couple of upper circle seats being all that Paul could obtain from the acting manager, and had been vastly impressed by Paul's dominating position in the stage fairy world, said to him with a sniff that choked a sigh, "Now that you've got all those pretty girls around you, I suppose you soon won't think of me any longer?" Paul waved the dreadful houris away as though they were midges. "I'm sick of girls," he replied in a tone of such sincerity that Jane tossed her head. "Oh, then I suppose you lump me with the rest. And are you sick of me too?" "Don't worry a fellow," said Paul. "You're not a girl. Not in that sense, I mean. You are a pal. Anyway, they are lots prettier than what I am," she said defiantly. He looked at her critically, after the brutal manner of obtuse boyhood, and beheld an object quite agreeable to the sight. Her Londoners' ordinarily colourless cheeks were flushed. Her blue eyes shone bright. Her little chin was in the air, and her parted lips showed a flash of white teeth. She wore a neat simple blouse and skirt, and held her slim half-developed figure taut. Paul shook his head. "Jolly few of them, without grease paint on." "But you see them all painted up." He burst into laughter. "Then they're beastly, nearby. You silly kid, don't you know? We've got to make up. Otherwise, no one in front world be able to see our mouths and noses and eyes From the front, we look lovely, but close to, we are horrors." "Well, how should I know that?" asked Jane. "You couldn't unless you saw us, or were told. But now you know." "Do you look beastly too?" "Vile," he laughed. "I am glad I didn't think of going on the stage," she said, childish, yet very feminine, unreason combining with atavistic puritanism. "I shouldn't like to paint my face." "You get used to it," said Paul, the experienced. "I think it's horrid to paint your face." He swung to the door. They were in the little parlour behind the shop, a flash of anger in his eyes. "If you think everything I do horrid, I can't talk to you." He marched out. Jane suddenly realized that she had behaved badly. She whipped herself. She had behaved atrociously. Of course she had been jealous of the theatre girls, but had he not been proving to her all the time in what small account he held them? And now he had gone. At 17, a beloved gone for an hour is a beloved gone forever. She rushed to the foot of the stairs on which his ascending steps still creaked. "Paul?" "Yes?" "Come back. Do come back." Paul came back and followed her into the parlour. "I'm sorry," she said. He graciously forgave her, having already arrived at the mature conclusion that females were unaccountable folk whose excursions into unreason should be regarded by man with pitying indulgence. And in spite of the seriousness with which he took himself, he was a sunny-tempered youth. Barney Bill, putting into the port of London, so to speak, in order to take in cargo, also visited the theatre towards the end of the run of the piece. He waited by arrangement for Paul outside the stage door, and Paul, coming out, linked arms and took him to a blazing bar in Piccadilly Circus, and ministered to his thirst with a princely air. "It seems rum," said Bill, wiping his lips with the back of his hand after a mighty pull at the pint tankard. "It seems rum that you should be standing me drinks at a swell place like this. It seems only yesterday that you was a 2 pen north of nothing, jogging along of me in the old bus." "I have moved a bit since then, haven't I?" said Paul. "You have, Sonny," said Barney Bill. "But," he sighed and looked around the noisy, glittering place, at the smart barmaids, the well-clad throng of loungers, some in evening dress, the half-dozen gorgeous ladies sitting with men at little tables by the window. "I thinks as how you gets more real happiness in a quiet village pub, and the beer is cheaper, and God blimey." He ran his finger between his stringy neck and the frayed stand-up collar that would have sawn his head off but for the toughness of his hide. To do Paul honour, he had arranged himself in his best, a wondrously cut and heavily braided morning coat and lavender-coloured trousers of eccentric shape, and a funny little billycock hat too small for him, and a thunder and lightning necktie, all of which he had purchased nearly 20 years ago to grace a certain wedding at which he had been best man. Since then he had worn the Nessus shirt of her costume not more than half a dozen times. The twisted, bright-eyed little man, so obviously ill at ease in his amazing garb, and the beautiful youth, debonair in his well-fitting blue serge, formed a queer contrast. "Don't you never long for the wind of God and the smell of the rain?" asked Barney Bill. "I haven't the time," said Paul. "I'm busy all day." "Well, well," said Barney Bill. "The fellow wasn't far wrong who said it takes all sorts to make a world. There are some as likes electric light, and some as likes the stars. Give me the stars." And in his countryman's way, he set the beer in his tankard, swirling round and round, before he put it again to his lips. Paul sipped his beer reflectively. "You may find happiness and peace of soul under the stars," said he sagely, "and if I were a free agent, I'd join you tomorrow. But you can't find fame. You can't rise to great things. I want to... well, I don't quite know what I want to do," he laughed. "But it's something big." "Yes, my boy," said Barney Bill. "I understand. You was always like that. You haven't come any nearer finding your high-born parents?" There was a twinkle in his eyes. "Have you?" "I am not going to bother any more about them, whoever they are," said Paul, lighting a cigarette. "When I was a kid, I used to dream that they would find me and do everything for me. Now I am a man with experience of life. I find that I've got to do everything for myself. And by George," he thumped the bar and smiled the radiant smile of the young Apollo, "I am going to do it." Barney Bill took off his Luke's iron crown of a billycock hat and scratched his cropped and grizzled head. "How old are you, Sonny?" "Nearly 19, said Paul. "By gosh," said Barney Bill. He put on his hat at a comfortable but rakish angle. He looked like a music hall humorist. A couple of the gorgeous ladies giggled. "Yes," said he, "you are a man with an experience of life, and nobody can do nothing for you but yourself. Poor old Barney Bill has been past helping you this many a year." "But I owe everything to you," cried Paul boyishly. "If it hadn't been for you, I should still be working in that factory at Bludston." Bill winked and nodded acquiescence as he finished his tankard. "I have often wondered, since I've grown up, what induced you to take me away? What was it?" Bill cocked his head on one side and regarded him queerly. "Now you're asking," said he. Paul persisted. "You must have had some reason." "I suppose I was interested in them parents of yours," said Barney Bill, and that was all he would say on the subject. The days went on. The piece had run through the summer and autumn, and Paul, a favourite with the management, was engaged for the next production. At rehearsal one day, the author put in a couple of lines, of which he was given one to speak. He now was, in very truth, an actor. Jane could no longer taunt him with her naughty moods, invariably followed by bitter repentance, with playing a dumb part like a trained dog. He had a real part, typewritten and done up in a brown paper cover, which was handed to him with lack of humour by the assistant stage manager. In the view of his own instantaneous success, he tried to persuade Jane to go on the stage. But Jane had no artistic ambitions, to say nothing of her disinclination to paint her face. She preferred the prosaic reality of stenography and typewriting. No sphere could be too dazzling for Paul. He was born to great things. The consciousness of his high destiny being at once her glory and her despair. But as regards herself, her outlook on life was cool and sober. Paul was peacock born. It was for him to strut about in iridescent plumage. She was a humble doe and knew her station. It must be said that Paul held out the stage as a career more on account of the social status that it would give to Jane than through a belief in her histrionic possibilities. He too, fond of as he was of the girl with whom he had grown up, recognized the essential difference between them. She was as pretty, as sensible, as helpful a little doe as ever chattered, but the young peacock never for an instant forgot her dawdom. Jane's profound common sense reaped its reward the following spring when she found herself forced to earn her livelihood. Her mother died, and the shop was sold, and an aunt in Cricklewood offered Jane a home on condition that she paid for her keep. This she was soon able to do when she obtained a situation with a business firm in the city. The work was hard and the salary small, but Jane had a brave heart and held her head high. In her simple philosophy, life was work and dreaming an occasional luxury. Her mother's death grieved her deeply, for she was a girl of strong affections, and the breaking up of her life with Paul seemed an irremediable catastrophe. "It is just as well," said her aunt, "that there's an end of it, or you'd be making a fool of yourself over that young actor chap with his pretty face. I don't hold with any of them." But Jane was too proud to reply. On their last night together in the Barn Street house, they sat alone in the little back parlour, as they had done for all the 6 years, all their impressionable childish days. It was the only home that Paul had known, and he felt the tragedy of its dissolution. They sat on the old horsehair sofa, behind the table, very tearful, very close together in spirit, holding each other's hands. They talked as the young talk, and the old, for the matter of that. She trembled at his wants unministered to in his new lodgings. He waved away prospective discomfort. What did it matter? He was a man and could rough it. It was she herself whose loss would be irreparable. She sighed. He would soon forget her. He vowed undying remembrance by all his gods. Some beautiful creature of the theatre would carry him off. He laughed at such absurdity. Jane would always be his confidant, his intimate. Even though they lived under different roofs, they would meet and have their long, happy jaunts together. Jane said dolefully that it could only be on Sundays, as their respective working hours would never correspond. "And you haven't given me your Sundays for a year," she added. Paul slid from the dark theme and, to comfort her, spoke glowingly of the future, when he should have achieved his greatness. He would give her a beautiful house with carriages and servants, and she would not have to work. "But if you're not there, what's the good of anything?" she said. "I'll come to see you, silly dear," he replied ingenuously. Before they parted for the night, she threw her arms round his neck impulsively. "Don't quite forget me, Paul. It would break my heart. I've only you left now my poor mother's gone." Paul kissed her and vowed again. He did not vow that he would be a mother to her, though to the girl's heart it seemed as if he did. The little girl was aching for a note in his voice that never came. Now, 99 youths in 100 who held at such a sentimental moment a comely and not uncared for maiden in their arms would have lost their heads and their hearts and vowed in the desired manner. But Paul was different, and Jane knew it to her sorrow. He was by no means temperamentally cold, far from it. But you see, he lived intensely in his dreams, and only on its outer fringe had Jane her place. In the heart of it, hidden in amethystine mist, from which only flashed the diadem on her hair, dwelt the exquisite, the incomparable lady, the princess who should share his kingdom, while he knelt at her feet and worshipped her and kissed the rosy tips of her calm fingers. So, as it never entered his head to kiss the fingertips of poor Jane, it never entered his head to fancy himself in love with her. Therefore, when she threw herself into his arms, he hugged her in a very sincere and brotherly way, but kissed her with a pair of cast lips of Adonis. Of course, he would never forget her. Jane went to bed and sobbed her heart out. Paul slept but little. The breaking up of the home meant the end of many precious and gentle things, and without them he knew that his life would be the poorer. And he vowed once more to himself that he would never prove disloyal to Jane. While he remained in London, he saw what he could of her, sacrificing many a Sunday's outing with the theatre folk. Jane, instinctively aware of this, and finding in his demeanour, after examining it with femininely jealous microscopic eyes, nothing perfunctory, was duly grateful and gave him of his girlish best. She developed very quickly after her entrance into the world of struggle. Very soon it was the woman and not the child who listened to the marvellous youth's story of the wonders that would be. She never again threw herself into his arms, and he never again called her a little silly. She was dimly aware of change, though she knew that the world could hold no other man for her. But Paul was not. And then Paul went on tour. End of chapter 6.